How are you, dear friends? Today we are going to continue our series of applied neuroanatomy and anatomy of the cranial nerves. And today we are going to discuss a very important sensory nerve, which is the vestibulocochlear nerve. The vestibulocochlear nerve, as you all know, is the 8th cranial nerve. It is a sensory nerve responsible for hearing and equilibrium. It is composed of two nerves actually, the vestibular nerve and the cochlear nerve, that are different in their receptors, their nerves, their nuclei, and the different central pathways. Both nerves arise from the lower pons at the cerebellopontine angle, at the junction between the pons and the upper medulla, with the facial nerve as one bundle to the internal auditory meatus. The vestibular nerve, gross anatomy of the vestibular nerve. Vestibular nerve, it is a sensory nerve, purely sensory. It enters the lower pons at the cerebellopontine angle, below the exit of the facial nerve and above the cochlear nerve. If you remember, at the root entry zone, we said that MIFC, from anterosuperior to posterior-inferior, the motor part of the facial nerve, nervus intermedius, then the vestibular and the cochlear. Cochlear being the most anteroinferior. Vestibular nerve is composed of three nerves actually. Two are very famous, which are the superior and inferior vestibular nerves, and one is less important, which is the peripheral vestibular nerve, coming from separate vestibular receptors for equilibrium in the inner ear. So these nerves arise from the vestibular receptors in the inner ear, as we will see. Superior vestibular nerve arises from the lateral and the superior semicircular canals, from the utricule and the sacule, as we will see, and we'll know the functions right in one moment, while the inferior vestibular nerve arises from the posterior semicircular canal and the sacule. So, superior vestibular nerve and the inferior vestibular nerve arise from the sacule. They have in common that impulses pass from the sacule through the superior vestibular and from the sacule also to the inferior vestibular nerve. The peripheral vestibular nerve is a small nerve of less importance. The receptors are present on the undersurface of the semicircular canals, and it passes in the internal auditory canal, reaches it via the foramen singular, as we'll see. The nerve, the vestibular nerve, is actually the central axon of the vestibular ganglion, Scarpa's ganglion, in the internal auditory canal, always with the sensation, as you saw, with the vision, and you will see with the hearing. There is a sensory ganglion. In this case is the vestibular ganglion, who has bipolar cells having a central part and the peripheral part. The central part transmits impulses from the receptor to the cell, and the central axons form the nerve, as we will see. In the internal auditory canal, the vestibular nerves are located posterior, with the superior vestibular nerve posterior to the facial nerve, separated from it by the vertical crest or Bill's bar, and the inferior vestibular nerve posterior to the cochlear nerve, separated from the superior by the transverse crest. We talked about it in facial nerve, and we'll talk about it right now again. So this is a diagram showing the ear, the external auditory canal, the ossicles in the middle ear, and the stapes, and entering the vestibule, and from the vestibule we have the semicircular canals, which are the anterior or superior semicircular canal, the posterior or inferior semicircular canal sharing one limb, and the lateral or the horizontal semicircular canal. So these are the three semicircular canals. This is the vestibule. This is the start of the vestibular nerve, and this is the start of the cochlear nerve. As we said, the superior vestibular nerve receives impulses from the anterior semicircular canal and from the lateral semicircular canal or horizontal. Anterior or superior, lateral or horizontal, it also receives impulses from the utricule, from the sacule, while the inferior vestibular nerve receives impulses from the sacule and from the posterior semicircular canals. Again, superior vestibular nerve receiving from the anterior semicircular canal, from the lateral semicircular canal, from the utricule, and from the sacule. Inferior vestibular nerve impulses from the sacule and from the posterior or inferior semicircular canal. Another more clear view, we have here the anterior or superior semicircular canal sharing the same limb as the posterior or inferior semicircular canal, and here is the lateral or horizontal semicircular canal, and here is the superior vestibular nerve with the Scarpa's ganglion or the vestibular ganglion. The peripheral axons receive impulses from the receptors, and the central axons form the nerve. Superior vestibular receives from the utricule, from the superior semicircular canal, the lateral semicircular canal, and from the sacule. The inferior vestibular nerve receives from the sacule and from the posterior or the inferior semicircular canal. And then the vestibular nerve passes into the internal auditory canal. It is situated in the posterior part of the internal auditory canal, being separated. Superior vestibular nerve is posterior and up. Inferior vestibular nerve is posterior and down. So this superior vestibular, inferior vestibular. Superior vestibular is separated from the facial nerve by the vertical crest or Bill's bar after William House, and the facial and superior vestibular are separated from the cochlear and inferior vestibular by falciform crest or the transverse crest. This is a more detailed view, a real view. This is anterior and this is posterior. The 7 up, the facial nerve, is in the anterior upper part of the internal auditory canal and is separated by Bill's bar from the superior vestibular nerve. Also, the cochlear nerve is anterior and inferior, and behind it is the inferior vestibular nerve. Behind the inferior vestibular nerve is the foramen singular, which is transmitting fibers from the peripheral vestibular nerve. This is the transverse crest. This is Bill's bar. Sorry. Here is a view of the internal auditory canal. This is posterior. You see the superior vestibular and the inferior vestibular. This is anterior. You see the facial nerve with the nervus intermedius and the cochlear nerve. Another view at the cerebellopontine angle. You note that the most anterior and superior is the facial nerve, motor part, nervus intermedius. Then the vestibular and the cochlear is the postero-inferior part, and you see it winds around the inferior vestibular nerve, occupying the anterior compartment. These are the lower cranial nerves. More detailed view, this is the internal auditory canal of the left side. This is medial, this is lateral. We took the superior vestibular nerve up, and we saw in front of it the facial with the nervus intermedius, and we took also the inferior vestibular nerve up, and we saw the cochlear nerve. This is a more detailed view. When we took the superior vestibular and the inferior vestibular down, we saw the facial nerve and the nervus intermedius in front, and this is an operative view. Of course, this is the ICA, and this is the branch of the ICA, which is the internal auditory artery. The anatomy of the vestibular pathway, we talked about the vestibular nerve, we're going to talk about the vestibular pathway. As we said, the vestibular receptors are the utricule, the sacule, and the semicircular canals. The utricule and the sacule are present in the vestibule, and they are responsible for the position of the head at rest. The utricule is responsible for the horizontal position of the head at rest. The sacule is responsible for the vertical position of the head at rest. So when the head is not moving, you are receiving information about the position and important for the equilibrium at rest. The horizontal position of the head, the position is from the utricle, the receptors in the utricle, and the vertical position of the head, impulses come from the receptors in the sacule. The semicircular canals are responsible for rotation, for the motion. So they are active in motion, and that's why the semicircular canals are present in three planes, in the sagittal, in the axial, in the coronal plane, because they give the sense of rotation of the head, whether by rotation of the head by the muscles of the neck, or by external rotation, like when present in a car or a roller coaster, for instance. The function of the vestibular nerve is data processing for the position, as we said, for the posture you are going to take according to the position, and for the motion, if you are moving or not. So these are the 5 receptors of the vestibular pathway: utricle, sacule, at rest; utricle, horizontal; sacule, vertical; semicircular canals at motion. This is another view showing the vestibulocochlear system. This is the utricle, this is the sacule, this is the semicircular canals, and the ampulla, dilatation at the proximal end, which is called the ampulla of the semicircular canal. This is the anterior semicircular canal, sharing one limb with the posterior or inferior semicircular canal, anterior or superior, and there is the lateral semicircular canal. Those are for motion and those are for rest. Another view: the anterior semicircular canal, posterior semicircular, lateral, ampulla of the semicircular canals, the sacule, the utricle here, and the sacule here. And here is the endolymphatic duct, which is essential for forming the endolymph from the CSF and back again to the CSF. Anatomy of the vestibular pathway. As we said, the superior vestibular nerve carries sensation from the utricle, the sacule, the superior and lateral semicircular canals. The inferior vestibular nerve carries impulses from the sacule and the posterior semicircular canals, and both nerves are the central axons of the bipolar cells of Scarpa's ganglia or the vestibular ganglia present in the internal auditory canal, and the vestibular nerve passes from the internal auditory canal to the cerebellopontine angle, reaching the vestibular nuclei. So here, as we said, superior vestibular, inferior vestibular, the superior semicircular canal or the anterior, and the lateral, receiving also from the utricle and from the sacule, utricle and sacule, and the inferior vestibular receiving from the posterior or inferior semicircular canal and also from the sacule. And these are Scarpa's ganglion, containing bipolar cells or vestibular ganglia, peripheral axons received from the receptors, central axons from the vestibular nerve. Beside it is the cochlear nerve. Anatomy of the vestibular nerve. The pathway: the vestibular nerve as it passes from Scarpa's ganglion, cerebellopontine angle, it reaches the vestibular nuclei, which are 4 nuclei, superior, inferior, medial, lateral, vestibular nuclei, which are situated actually in the medulla. Remember the medulla, the open medulla, we have the vestibular area, which is lateral to the vagal triangle. So the vestibular nuclei are 4, and they send 4 efferent pathways: the vestibulospinal to the spinal cord, vestibulo-reticular to the reticular formation, vestibulocerebellar, and to the medial longitudinal fasciculus. Why? Because this information they are giving about the posture, about the position, is very essential for the posture. So the information to affect the posture, it has to be given to the spinal cord, has to be given to the cerebellum, has to be given to the medial longitudinal fasciculus, which is organizing the motion of the eyes with the position they receive from the vestibular nerve and to the reticular formation. So this is a diagrammatic view showing that the impulses reach from the semicircular canals, from the ampullae, from the utricule macula, and from the sacule macula, and pass through the vestibular nerve. Here is the Scarpa's ganglion, the cells, peripheral axons, central axons, from the vestibular nerve, reaching the vestibular nuclei, are the superior, the inferior, the lateral, and the medial vestibular nuclei. And we have 4 vestibular nuclei and 4 afferents from the vestibular nuclei, one to the spinal cord, the other one to the medial longitudinal fasciculus, and a third one to the cerebellum and to the reticular formation. Here, the medial longitudinal fasciculus gives impulses to the nuclei responsible for the ocular motility, which is the abducent, the trochlear, and the oculomotor nerve. So it receives information from the vestibular nuclei to harmonize the movements of the eyes with the sense of position during rest or motion. So vestibular nerves, vestibular nuclei, and the efferents from the vestibular nuclei to the spinal cord, to the cerebellum, to the medial longitudinal fasciculus, and to the reticular formation. Here another view: vestibular ganglia, central axons forming the vestibular nerve, reaching the vestibular nuclei, the superior, the inferior, the lateral, and the medial, and these nuclei sends efferents to the spinal cord, to the medial longitudinal fasciculus, and to the cerebellum, and to the reticular formation. Notice here that there is a direct and indirect vestibulocerebellar pathways. The indirect, as we said, is from the vestibular nuclei to the cerebellum, and some fibers pass directly from the vestibular nerve to the cerebellum without relaying in the cerebellar nuclei. So the central vestibular pathway is 4. One is reaching the cerebellum directly, the others are reaching the 4 vestibular nuclei, and the efferents from the vestibular nuclei are in 4 places: spinal cord, medial longitudinal fasciculus, reticular formation, and the cerebellum. So we have the direct vestibulocerebellar pathway to the cerebellum and the indirect from the vestibular nuclei to the cerebellum. And here the medial longitudinal fasciculus, medial longitudinal bundle, as we said, is sending impulses or branches to efferents to the abducent, trochlear, and the oculomotor, harmonizing motion of the eye with the information taken from the vestibular apparatus. The cochlear nerve is the second part of the eighth cranial nerve. Gross anatomy: it enters the lower pons at the cerebellopontine angle as one bundle with the vestibular nerve below the origin of the facial and the vestibular. If you remember, the MIFC, motor part, nervus intermedius, vestibular, and the last is the cochlear. And we saw before, as the nerve passes in the cerebellopontine angle cistern, it passes from behind to front. We said the origin is anteroinferior. It curves under the inferior vestibular nerve to occupy the lower anterior quadrant of the internal auditory canal below the facial nerve in front of the inferior vestibular nerve, and being separated from the facial nerve by the transverse crest. The cochlear nerve receives impulses from the outer and inner hair cells in the organ of Corti, which is the receptor, or the effector, the receptor of hearing, as we'll see now, to the spiral ganglia. The other one was carpus ganglia. This is the spiral ganglia for hearing to the nerve. And remember also that the cochlea forms 2.5 turns in the inner ear. So let's see what we said right now. Anterosuperior, posterior-inferior, the cochlear nerve passes laterally into the internal auditory canal and in their way to the cochlea, which is formed of 2.5 turns. The vestibular is in its way to the semicircular canals, utricule and sacule. Here is the middle ear, and here is the tympanic membrane, and this is the left ear. If you go the gross anatomy, you take this cerebellum medially, and this is lateral, this is rostral, and this is caudal. This is the left side. If you see the trigeminal nerve, then the 7th and 8th as one bundle with the ICA, and the lower cranial nerves 9, 10, and 11 below. This is an operative view, and you see here, up is the trigeminal, this is the right side, and here is the 7th and the 8th cranial nerves. Here, see here the superior vestibular, inferior vestibular, hiding the 7th and the 8th, and the ICA with the internal auditory artery arising from the ICA, and here is the lower cranial nerves. Another view in the canal, as we said before, this is the facial nerve, anterosuperior, 7 up, the cochlear nerve down, superior vestibular, and inferior vestibular posteriorly. This is a diagrammatic view showing how the auditory nerve is formed by different fibers from the different scattered organs of Corti, from different scattered spiral ganglia, reaching proximally forming the cochlear nerve. The hearing pathway, as we said, the receptor for hearing is the organ of Corti, present inside the cochlea. In a cross-section of the cochlea, as we will see, we find that the organ of Corti is present in the cochlear duct. You will see it right now. So the organ of Corti lies in the cochlear duct, what we call the scala media. Cochlear duct or scala media is the same. The cochlear duct is one of 3 spaces. If you do a cross-section along the cochlea, you'll find 3 spaces that appear in a cross-section of the cochlea, which are the cochlear duct, scala media in between, containing endolymph. Above it, the scala vestibuli, and below it, the scala tympani. So, 3 spaces, the cross-section of the cochlea, the superior scala vestibuli, inferior scala tympani, and in between the scala media, the scala vestibuli and the scala tympani contain perilymph. The scala media or the cochlear duct contains endolymph. So you'll see one of the real miracles God has created, which is the hearing. How do we hear? This is an amazing process, a very complex and wonderful process, as we'll see now. So when the sound vibrates the tympanic membrane, vibrations are transmitted to the ossicles, which are the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, as you will see, then to the oval window, from the oval window to the perilymph in the scala vestibuli and the scala tympani. And when the perilymph moves, it vibrates, it shifts the basilar membrane, which is present between the scala media and scala tympani in relation to the tectorial membrane. This seems like a big mystery or a big quiz. Actually, it is not. You'll see the diagrams now and you'll understand how simple it is. We can simplify it and you can understand it very easily. So don't panic. So this is a cross-section, a sagittal view of the inner ear, the cochlea. This is the external ear, the auricle. These are the ossicles in the middle ear. This is the oval window, and the perilymph is present above and below. Above in the scala vestibuli, below scala tympani, and in between the scala media or the cochlear duct containing endolymph. You also notice that the base of the cochlea is responsible for the high frequency hearing, while the tip of the cochlea is responsible for low frequency hearing. This is the first view of the organ of Corti, as we'll see. Another cross-section, sagittal view, the ear, tympanic membrane, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. The stapes is closing the oval window, and the transmission of the vibration from the tympanic membrane to the ossicles, through the stapes, through the oval window to the perilymph. Vibration is transmitted in the perilymph in the scala vestibuli and to the scala tympani, and this is surrounding scala media containing the endolymph, and in between the scala tympani and the endolymph carrying the tectorial membrane is something called the basilar membrane, as we will see. And then the organ of Corti is here, and there is another membrane on the organ of Corti, which is called the tectorial membrane. We'll try to explain it several times so that you will understand it. So slowly, if you do a cross-section in the cochlea, we'll find too many spaces because there are too many turns in the cochlea. As we said, 2.5 turns. So let's take one of these spaces. We'll see what. This is 3 spaces in each cross-section. The scala vestibuli above, scala tympani below, and the scala media or cochlear duct in between, and the organ of Corti. The receptor for hearing is present in the cochlear duct, the scala media, and it is resting on a membrane called the basilar membrane, separating it from the scala tympani. And there is a fixed membrane carrying the cilia of the hair cells, because the organ of Corti is magnification of the organ of Corti. You see that it is resting in the cochlear duct or resting in the scala media, resting on a basilar membrane, separating it from the scala tympani, and it is consisting of supporting cells and hair cells. There are 3 layers of outer hair cells and one layer of inner hair cell. Although these are 3 layers of outer hair cells, they are responsible for 5% of the hearing, while the inner layer, the single layer of inner hair cells, is responsible for 95% of the hearing. And as we said, the hair cells have cilia which are embedded in the tectorial membrane, and the tectorial membrane is fixed to the bone. So this is a fixed membrane, and the basilar is a fixed membrane, and the axons arise from the hair cells. Another view: scala vestibuli, scala tympani, scala media, or the cochlear duct. The organ for hearing is the organ of Corti, resting on a basilar membrane, separating the scala tympani from the scala media or the cochlear duct, and it has also an upper membrane, which is the tectorial membrane, receiving the cilia of the hair cells. Another view, as we said. And after that we have the spiral ganglia, receiving from the hair cells and sending information to the cochlear nerve, which reaches the cochlear nuclei, and then they form the trapezoid body, superior olivary nucleus, lateral lemniscus, and inferior colliculus, medial longitudinal bundle, and hearing area in the brain, Hassel's gyrus, as we will see. So this is a quick view, but we go into detail. The hearing pathway. As the organ of Corti, as we said, rests on the basilar membrane, as we said, and the cilia of the hair cells of the organ of Corti are embedded in the tectorial membrane. The motion of the basilar membrane, why does it move? As we said before, vibration from the tympanic membrane go to the ossicles, through the oval window to the perilymph, moving the scala tympani, the scala vestibuli and scala tympani, and moving, vibrating the basilar membrane. But the tectorial membrane is fixed, so the stereocilia in the tectorial membrane are activated or deactivating the hair cells. So when the impulse reaches the scala tympani, it is transmitted to the basilar membrane and the organ of Corti, vibrating it in relation to the tectorial membrane containing the cilia. This will do some vibration and stretch on the cilia. And the cilia, we said, are the cilia of the hair cells. Hair cells are the cells for hearing, which are present in the organ of Corti, as we said, and they are of 3 layers of outer hair cells and 1 layer of inner hair cells. As we said, the inner hair cells are responsible for 95% of the discharge to the cochlear nerve, and the outer hair cells are responsible for 5%. The hair cilia, the function of the cilia of the hair cells, change mechanical energy into electrical energy, passing through the cochlear nerve via opening and closing of potassium channels. So what is the function of the hair cells present in the organ of Corti is to transfer or change the vibrations present in the basilar membrane and accordingly in the hair cells into an electrical energy via the potassium channels, closing and opening some of the pathways of the hair cells, and the electric sensation passes in the peripheral axons of the spiral ganglion, whose central axons form the cochlear nerve. So again, this is the vestibular, the scala vestibuli, scala tympani, and the scala media. and the hair cells are present in the organ of Corti. 3 outer layers, 1 inner layer. Inner layer is responsible 95% of the impulses. These are responsible for 5% only of the impulses. And when the vibration comes from the ossicles, transmitted to the perilymph in the scala vestibuli, reaching the scala tympani, vibrating the basilar membrane, vibrating the whole organ of Corti, vibrating it in relation to the tectorial membrane, stretching on the cilia of the hair cells, which will open and close potassium channels, potassium pumping, which will change the mechanical energy into electrical energy, passing through the auditory nerve fibers, spiral ganglia, to the cochlear nerve. Again, the organ of Corti is a fixed membrane. Basilar membrane is a membrane that might vibrate. Vibrations of the basilar membrane, because of the vibration of the perilymph, which is present between the cochlear duct or the scala media and the scala tympani, is causing stretch and vibration on the cilia, which will result opening and closing potassium channels, which will depolarize the hair cells and will cause electric impulses. These outer layers responsible for 5% of the impulses, and the inner hair cells, they discharge 95% of the impulses to the fibers of the cochlear nerve, spiral ganglia, forming the cochlear nerve. Another view. Here is basilar membrane, cochlear duct or scala media, and the scala tympani, and outer layers of hair cell, 3. The cilia are embedded in the tectorial membrane. The single layer of inner hair cells. The cilia are embedded in the tectorial membrane, and from these hair cells, the fibers will pass, forming the pathway to the spiral ganglion. These are the peripheral fibers of the bipolar cells, the spiral ganglion. The central ones will form the cochlear nerve. So the healing pathway, again, cochlear nerve transmits impulses from, now we understood how is hearing formed, vibrations, tympanic membrane, ossicles, perilymph, basilar membrane, organ of Corti is vibrated, tectorial membrane is fixed, stretching on the cilia which are embedded in tectorial membrane generates this mechanical motion generates sodium pump pathway, opening some of the receptors and closing some of the receptors into the hair cells, which transmit mechanical pulsation, change it into electrical pulsation, and passes through the cochlear nerve. Healing pathway, as we said, from the spiral ganglion, the central axons form the cochlear nerve, which will reach the cochlear nuclei situated in the medulla, which are the dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei, as you will see, ventral and dorsal to the inferior cerebellar peduncle or the restiform body. Dorsal cochlear nucleus, as you will see, sends impulses mainly to the contralateral spinal lemniscus nuclei, the spinal lemniscus, and few to the ipsilateral. So dorsal cochlear nucleus, impulses to the contralateral spinal lemniscus nuclei and forms the spinal lemniscus. The ventral cochlear nucleus sends also to the contralateral, but not the spinal lemniscus nuclei, contralateral superior olivary nucleus, forming the trapezoid body, fibers from the ventral cochlear nucleus to the contralateral lemniscus, passing transversely called the trapezoid body, and some reaching the superior olivary nucleus, and some are to the ipsilateral olivary nucleus. and fibers from the dorsal cochlear nucleus and the superior olivary nucleus, as you will see, pass to the nuclei of the lateral lemniscus. Impulses pass from the spinal lemniscus to the inferior colliculus, then the medial geniculate body, and to the auditory area 41, 42, Hassel's gyrus, in the middle of the superior temporal gyrus, as we will see. So, if you see here, this is a picture of the pons, transverse pontine fibers. This is anterior, this is posterior. This is the inferior cerebellar peduncle, or not the pons, sorry, this is the, yes, it is the caudal pons. These are the cochlear nuclei. The dorsal is dorsal and the ventral is ventral to the inferior cerebellar peduncle. This is the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and you see that the impulses reach from the cochlea, as we said, and it passes to the dorsal and the ventral cochlear nuclei, which are dorsal and ventral to the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The impulses pass from the dorsal nuclei to the ipsilateral and sometimes the contralateral, lateral lemniscus, and fibers from the ventral nucleus, the ventral cochlear nucleus, pass to the superior olivary complex, and from the superior olivary complex also through the lateral lemniscus. So here, as we see, that the fibers that impulses leave the cochlear nuclei to the ipsilateral and to the contralateral side. To the ipsilateral side and the contralateral lateral lemniscus from the dorsal nuclei, and the ventral nuclei to the contralateral superior olivary, and then to the nuclei of the lateral lemniscus, forming the lateral lemniscus. Lateral lemniscus will end in the inferior colliculus, inferior colliculus to the medial geniculate body, medial geniculate body, the auditory radiation in the sublenticular part of the internal capsule, reaching auditory area 41, 42 in the middle of the superior temporal gyrus. Again, receptors, the hair cells, as we said, and you all remember how is mechanical impulses or mechanical energy is transformed into electric energy. Spiral ganglia, cochlear nerve, reaching cochlear nuclei, dorsal cochlear nuclei, contralateral nuclei of the lateral lemniscus, and the ventral nuclei to the contralateral inferior superior olive to the lateral lemniscus also, and some of the fibers pass ipsilaterally to the ipsilateral lateral lemniscus. So as we said, fibers cross from the dorsal cochlear nuclei, contralateral side, and fibers cross from the ventral nuclei to the superior olive of the contralateral and superior olive of the ipsilateral side, and they form the lateral lemniscus, reaching the inferior colliculus, reaching the medial geniculate body, from the medial geniculate body to the Hassel's gyrus, the auditory area 41, 42. Surgical importance of the cochlear nucleus is the site of implantation of the brainstem implants. Where do you find the cochlear nucleus? In the lateral recess of the fourth ventricle. You widen the foramen of Luschka, and you find that the anterior border of the lateral recess of the fourth ventricle is the cochlear nucleus, and this is where we put our brainstem implants. Functions of the inferior colliculus is a wonderful function, as you will see. The first function, you know it integrates the signal of hearing to the medial geniculate body and to the brain, and it differentiates sound frequency and pitch. to differentiate the different sound frequencies. If you hear many sounds at the same time, differentiates the frequency, the intensity, and the quality of the sounds and the pitch of the sound. It acts as a filter also against swallowing, vocalization, and breathing. So what happens if you damage the inferior colliculus? You will lose this filter. And in this case, you get a central hearing loss. What is central hearing loss? If you stay in a calm room, you can hear somebody is talking. But if you have a noisy background, you will not hear. Because if you have a noisy background and you are listening to one person in the noisy background, function of the inferior colliculus is to differentiate the voice you are hearing from other noisy backgrounds, and you concentrate with what you are hearing, differentiating it. If you damage this inferior colliculus, you will hear the sounds mixed together, so you will not understand what he's saying. This is the central deafness. Central deafness, you hear very well in a closed, calm room, but you hear different sounds you cannot differentiate, and you will not hear the patient in front of you. Also acts as a filter against swallowing, vocalization, and breathing. Imagine if every breath, every swallowing, and every talk is transmitted from your body to the ear. This will be hell. You cannot sleep, you cannot hear other voices, you cannot breathe. So to hear people, you have to stop breathing. But what makes the filter of my breath, of my swallowing, and my vocalization? I don't hear that much my voice. I hear it from outside. But if you don't have this filter, you will hear these voices from inside, what you talk, what you swallow, and what you breathe. So this is a very important function of the inferior colliculus, differentiating the pitches, sending signals to the mid-genicular body, and filtering local sounds, swallowing, vocalization, and breathing. Function of the superior olivary nucleus, it is very important for the lateralization of the sound. From where is coming the sound? From the right or from the left? This utmost importance for animals. If you are in the dark and a deer hears a sound from the right, reflexly, through the superior olivary nucleus, she can localize, or it can localize from where is the sound, and it runs on the opposite way. Also for the man, if you are in danger and you don't see what you hear, only hear, you don't see what you have, and you hear a sound from one side, you go and run on the other way, away from the sound. How did you equalize, how did you lateralize the sound coming from the right or coming from the left, coming from anterior or posterior? Through the superior olivary nucleus. Very important function. Thank you.